Now, to open our sermon today, I'd like to share a prayer that Fred Rogers prayed each and every day when he stepped onto the set of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Please pray with me. Dear Lord, let some word heard here today be yours. Amen. In 1985, Fred Rogers appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And it was an unmitigated disaster. Now, this was the early years of Oprah, long before her book club or Super Soul Sundays, and Fred Rogers wasn't your ordinary, typical talk show kind of guest. Mr. Rogers, perhaps seeing the problem before it became a problem, gave very specific instructions to his public relations guy, David Newell, who, by the way, played Mr. McFeely on the show, the Speedy Delivery Man. The instructions were this, that there were to be no children present during the taping of the show. None in the audience, no call-ins, no surprise kids coming from stage left, no kids. Well, that kind of appears to be a funny instruction for a man who is an icon for children's television, a man who was known for his ability to communicate with the youngest of America's TV viewers in honest and foundational and profound ways. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, requested no kids because Fred Rogers knew himself. He knew that if children were present, that he wouldn't be able to focus on Oprah's questions. He knew that if there was even one child around, that he was going to give him or her his full attention, disregarding the thousands, perhaps millions of people at home tuning in. And if that were the case, he wouldn't get a chance to talk about the importance of his work, the things that he was doing on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which, after all, was the goal of the interview. David Newell, the PR guy / Speedy Delivery Man, told the Oprah show staff that if there are children in the audience, Fred knows he'll do a poor job of helping Oprah to make the interview a success. And so when Mr. Rogers arrived for the taping of the interview, what did he find? An audience of families. The majority of the people in that room were under the age of 7. The Winfrey staff had decided that after he had an interview with Oprah, that it would be fun to see him take questions from the audience and to engage with the thoughts and give guidance to the parents' presence in the room. And what sounded like a good idea, again, was a disaster, in terms of what Oprah was going for anyway. When he sat through this interview with Oprah, they were facing each other, and yet you saw him sort of naturally shifting his posture towards the audience and sort of hunching over, taking this childlike stature. And as soon as the audience questions portion of the show started, he then sat on the floor, and then he moved to the edge of the stage, and then all of a sudden he was sort of crouching in the aisleways up in the stands. And he waited patiently for kids to ask their questions, and in full Mr. Rogers style, he gave slow, thoughtful responses. When Mr. Rogers was in a room, everything slowed down. Everything became more quiet and thoughtful. That's what his show did, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and that was the man in real life. He was slow and thoughtful, especially around kids. Later in his life, he would identify these attributes as his greatest gifts and his legacy. Well, all of this made for a really awkward television show for adults. Oprah looked visibly uncomfortable during the show. Several times she interrupted him to try to move this time along, but Fred Rogers kind of ignored her. And at one point, a child broke away from the audience and ran up to Fred Rogers to give him a hug, and everyone in the room looked surprised except Fred Rogers, who graciously accepted that hug. And what really took the cake was this moment. Fred Rogers went into the audience, and he sort of stooped next to a boy who had his hand raised, and he had a worried look on his face. And the boy's attention was consumed by the train, the neighborhood trolley that was part of the show's set. The train tracks were sort of precariously positioned towards the edge of Oprah's stage, and the train tracks kind of went off the stage and were hanging into nowhere. And the boy was so concerned about those train tracks and the safety of the train that he wasn't able to focus on anything else. And so Mr. Rogers heard what he was saying, and together they went and fixed it during the show. And at that moment, Oprah sort of had this completely overwhelmed look on her face. The interview was out of control. She just kind of had to ride it out. You can view clips of the old Oprah Winfrey show online, and that episode is tough to sit through because nothing seemed to fit together. But every weekday, from 1967 to 2001, 34 years, this soft-spoken man seemed to make everything fit and make sense again when he arrived at his neighborhood house, changed out of his suit jacket, putting on his cardigan and boat shoes, all while singing about this precious opportunity to be ourselves and to be neighbors together. By the way, Fred's mom, Nancy, knitted every one of those iconic cardigans, one of which is in the Smithsonian today. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was lulling and calming and mesmerizing to children. And even when me in my adult years, I tuned into the show and I watched a lot of Mr. Rogers this week, I found myself sort of relaxing into that familiar routine of it all. And I happily waited for him to feed the fish and to silently draw a picture or to sort of slowly assemble a musical instrument before he sent us off into the neighborhood of make-believe. When Fred Rogers was asked why he got into television, why he created Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he would tell people that right about the time he graduated from Rollins College, children's television was on the rise, and one day he saw a show where people were throwing pies in each other's face. And it was loud, and it was chaotic, and it was demeaning. That was his word. And nothing made Fred Rogers more mad than when he saw one person demean another. To him, the world offered too many opportunities for people to demean each other, to yell and to scream, and not enough opportunities to uplift and build and appreciate the people around us and the world around us. The world needed more opportunities for neighborliness. Does that sound familiar? I think it does. And for 34 years, Fred Rogers not only safeguarded 30 minutes of positive TV time, he introduced generations of children to holy disciplines like contemplation and reflection, curiosity and honesty, gratitude, and the effort of seeing people through the eyes of God. I think one of Fred Rogers' greatest contributions to our culture was his fierce defense of every person's worth. In 1968, Fred invited an African-American man named Francois Clemens to appear on the show as the police officer of the neighborhood. Officer Clemens was introduced to the world when Mr. Rogers was sitting outside his house, dangling his feet into this blue plastic kiddie pool. He was cooling himself off on a hot summer day, he said. And he asked Officer Clemens, who was just passing by, if he would like to join him and cool off. And he did. Officer Clemens took off his shoes and socks and dangled his feet into the pool right beside Fred Rogers. And this was during a time in our nation's history where black families were being chased away from public pools where white people were swimming. Mr. Rogers was making a strong statement about worth. In 1981, he invited a child named Jeff Erlanger on his show who used a power wheelchair to get around. And Fred Rogers marveled at his ability to control such a machine. And he calmly asked him to explain why he needed a chair like this. And so Jeff told the world about a tumor he had as a baby and how it affected his growth and ability to move like other kids did. To that, Mr. Rogers stated that he was so proud of him for sharing and thanked all of the doctors that took care of him and helped him to move. And together they sang that song, "It's You I Like," a statement on worth. When a parent wrote into the show letting them know that their blind daughter was always worried about whether or not the fish were fed on the show, which was part of the opening routine of that show, Mr. Rogers offered, in addition to his show, a pronouncement saying, "Here I am feeding the fish." He added that to every show for her, a statement of worth for that one child. Fred Rogers was constantly opening his audience to the value and the worth of others, no matter their skin color, the abilities of their body or mind. And what more, he showcased the differences of people and highlighted the giftedness of people day in and day out. Artists and musicians, great thinkers and researchers, shopkeepers and manufacturers, everyone contributed something special to the world. Worth. A sacred worth was at the heart of Fred Rogers' call to children's television. In preparing for this sermon series, I kept asking myself, where do we nowadays have people opening our world in such a way? Where on TV or in the news or in the newspaper or in our social activities in our church? Where are the places that people are introduced to differences and asked to see them and marvel at them and relate to them? And the examples that came to mind were few and far between, sadly. And yet it is biblical. Its need is biblical. In our reading from 1 Corinthians today, we hear, "Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit as to form one body, whether Jew or Gentile, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one, but of many." Paul goes on to remind us to appreciate difference. And we cannot all be hands or eyes, ears or feet. We need each other just as we are. And yet, as churches, we tend to surround ourselves with just eyes or just hands. Perhaps we are all just a bunch of rumps. We surround ourselves with sameness. And yet we are called to uplift and bring dignity and worth to differences. And so I ask you today, what are our practices as a people that expose us to differences? What do you do as a discipline to appreciate others around you? Is it through your reading? Do you try to attend events that are put on by different cultures than you? I've found in my years of community ministry that people tend to naturally develop aversions or prejudices to people in situations different from their own. And yet it is always through experience and relationship where these aversions break down and we are able to be neighbors to one another. Fred Rogers had a great definition of neighbor. He said, "A neighbor is anyone you are with at the time, and especially that person in need." There is a great need for appreciation in our country today. There is a great need for seeing the worth. There is a great need for developing relationships in our community. Relationships help us to build bridges and friendships and common holy ground. Children of God, I ask you again, what are the practices in your life that expose you to difference, that offer you the opportunity to bring dignity and worth? Perhaps it's through service or through loving your neighbor. Perhaps it's through learning or experiencing new cultures, people different from you. I ask you to hold that question and that thought close to your heart this week, and to look around you for the worth that you are able to uplift and thank God for.